Welcome, everyone. And for those of you that don't know me, we may have some guests here this afternoon. I'm Joanne Carter. I'm the Executive Director of Results and Results Educational Fund in the U.S. And I just want to say about that two things. In addition to my role as Executive Director of Results, I also have the honor to serve as Vice Chair of the Global Stop Tuberculosis Partnership on the board. The Stop TB Partnership is the biggest global umbrella with over 1,500 partners in more than 100 countries working to end TB. And I also want to say, especially to the other folks in this room, that I am up here on the podium, but there are many partners in our Action Global Health Advocacy Partnership who are really the global leaders on tuberculosis. So I like to think that I'm a bit representing the work of the entire partnership that has moved these issues along in so many places in the world. And you'll hear from a couple of our partners with some interventions a little later. I also want to just begin by saying I want to thank our sponsors for this conference, particularly our premier sponsor, Johnson & Johnson, and also a number of other sponsors like the Stop TB Partnership and the TB Alliance and BD. I'm really excited about this session because I have a personal passion around tuberculosis, and having worked on this issue for the last 2 decades, I really firmly believe that it is right and important that Results and our partners in our Action Partnership be working on this issue, because I do believe that with tuberculosis, the biggest problem we have is not scientific or medical, but political. And you will hear from a number of people here also the other challenges, the scientific challenges, the research challenges, the medical challenges, but I believe all of those can be tackled if we actually tackle the political challenge of TB, because TB has literally risen to the top of infectious killers because it has been on the bottom of the political agenda. And TB now kills more people than HIV and malaria combined. And just a little bit of what I touched on yesterday in my opening. One of the greatest failures we have is that we're not reaching some 40% of the people who get sick with TB every year. We are leaving those folks behind with either no diagnosis and treatment or often inadequate diagnosis and treatment. And again, as a poverty issue and a rights issue, it is not an accident who is being left behind. It is, once again, people who are geographically, economically, socially isolated, and people who face other kinds of stigma. And so for us to actually bridge this gap is going to require very proactive work to commit to finding and reaching and using the quality diagnostics and some of the new treatments that we have to get to everyone. The last thing I'll just say is we do have a huge opportunity this year with a first ever UN high-level meeting on tuberculosis. You'll hear more about that from our speakers in September at the UN, where we are working to have a large group of world leaders come together for what could be a transformative moment around tuberculosis. Because achieving a specific, clear, ambitious targets and political commitments and an accountability framework could be the tool, the moment that could create a transformation for TB. But I would also say we know that no meeting is magic, and it's really going to be the work that goes into it going up to that, and it's the work that's gone on historically and the work that will go on afterwards to make sure that we are financing the programs, whether it be funding in the UK or Canada or the US to fund international programs and to fund the Global Fund from our partners, France, UK, Japan, all over the world, and whether it's also the work that people are doing in their own countries to make sure that there is increased funding and budget and political attention to TB. But September needs to be a moment when the sort of world finally unites behind the people that have been on the front lines fighting this disease and epidemic for years. I'm just going to introduce all 3 of our speakers at once, and then I'll invite them up to speak. We've got a really wonderful set of speakers today. First, we have Dr. Madhukar Pai. Dr. Madhu Pai is a Canadian Research Chair in Epidemiology and Global Health at McGill University. He's also Director of the McGill Global Health Programs and Associate Director of the McGill International TB Center. He did his medical training and community medicine residency in Vellore, India, completed his PhD in epidemiology at UC Berkeley, and then did a postdoctoral fellowship at UCSF. But what I want to tell you about him, two things. One is he's really a global leader on TB, and he is a natural advocate. And he was incredibly generous to literally fly down from Canada this morning and flying back later today just to be with us this afternoon when we reached out to him. And then we're going to hear from our colleague, Carol Nyirenda, who is one of the global leaders on tuberculosis and also on HIV. She is one of our partners in our Global Action Global Health Advocacy Partnership and the executive director and founder of CITAM Plus. And Carol will tell you a little bit more about CITAM Plus, but it was started and continues to be a patient-led organization providing Zambians with life-saving information and care on TB, HIV, and malaria. I would also say CITAM Plus is an amazing advocacy organization and is also doing some really remarkable and effective work with young leaders and building youth leaders. And Carol herself is an internationally known TB and HIV activist, leader, and spokesperson, has served on numerous global boards, including the board of the Global Fund, representing the communities delegations, and has been a lead spokesperson at many international events on the highest stages. And then third, I'm also thrilled we have here Dr. Takao Toda, who we are thrilled to have join us from Tokyo. Dr. Toda is the Vice President for Human Security and Global Health at JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, so their aid agency. He oversees strategic planning and implementing of Japan's ODA, and he has a wealth of knowledge and experience operationalizing human security. He got his PhD from the Graduate School of International Development at Nagoya University, and he also has a law degree, and will be able to provide us some real perspective on Japan's leadership, because Japan is one of the co-leaders of the UN high-level meeting on TB, and also really a global leader around universal health coverage. So to kick off this, I'm going to ask Dr. Madupai to share some remarks and give us, in some ways, basically a background and perspective about where we are in the TB epidemic and where we need to go. So I'm going to thank you so much. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the honor of inviting me. This is my first ever advocacy conference. I must say, and clearly, you guys have way more fun than we academics do in our boring meetings, especially TB meetings. Oh my God, don't even get me started. My wife goes to HIV conferences, and you have Elton John singing in the background, and you have Angelina Jolie flying in, and you have Bill Clinton strolling by, and our TB meetings are like, oh, shoot me, please. The most boring meetings ever. So we desperately need people like you to show up at TB meetings. Really, we need you. So I found, as Joanne mentioned, we have 10 million plus TB patients estimated, of whom 4 million are quote-unquote missing. That itself should give you a pause and say, which epidemic in the world can ever be eliminated if you don't even know what's happening to 40% of your patients, right? Something is fundamentally wrong. And this framework I find extremely helpful. It isn't my formulation. I don't quite know who said it, but I've used it. So there are 3 U's here. One is the unreached. So the 4 million could be broken up into 3 categories, but they're not watertight. They're overlapping. The unreached, the untested and the undiagnosed, and the unreported. And understanding why this happens is fundamental to figuring out what to do with these missing 4 million patients. So let me walk you through what I think are the key issues behind each of these 3 categories. What do we mean by the unreached? I think Joanne started getting into this by saying these are the most vulnerable and marginalized, but it's actually stunning that one of the biggest chunks of people who are missing are men. Men in the reproductive adult working age category. Fantastic data from a large number of studies from all over the world consistently showing the same thing. If you look at prevalence of TB, men have a 2-fold higher prevalence of TB. Why this is, what the biology behind this can be debated. and it's not quite clear, but men are genuinely at a higher risk of TB. But then when you look at notified cases, that is, cases that are actually showing up on our books, then there's a bigger gap for men than there is a gap for women. In other words, men have a higher rate of TB but show up less on our books. That means they are an extremely high-risk group that is often missing. And you don't have to be a scientist to figure this out. Try going to primary care clinics all over the world. You'll invariably find women and children and the elderly. The men, the young adult men, will be prominently missing in your clinics. They're not there waiting. They're not in the TB clinics. So where the heck are they? And why are they not showing up? And there's a whole set of studies trying to investigate why this is the case. So this paper in PLOS Medicine was a very important one. And Bertie Squire and others at London School are championing that this is a huge neglected area that we in the TB community are not quite addressing upfront, that men are an underserved high-risk group. Secondly, people are often seeking care. We think people are quietly sitting home and dying of TB. What are the odds of that happening in 2018? Surely, you will not quietly die at home. You will at least go seek someone in your locality. No matter which village, shanty town, slum you live in, there is somebody practicing some form of healthcare in every single place. And that's where people go when they have any form of sickness. And this beautiful analysis from the Gates Foundation from 13 countries show that 60% of TB patients begin their care-seeking pathway outside of the national tuberculosis programs. So in short, we thought as a TB community that we will build free DOT services and everybody will flock to us, and case closed. Turns out that we built and they've gone somewhere else. People are going actively to all forms of private, informal, quasi-trained practitioners and not going to the free DOT service that may be right there in the middle of the village. Why this is a whole another matter of discussion. And I'll give you a dramatic example of this, India. 80% of Indians go to private health sector, no matter what they have. And more than 50% of Indian TB patients are not going to the free government DOTS program, they're going somewhere else. And then when they go somewhere else, this is what happens to them. They get bounced around again and again and again through pharmacists, through informal providers, through alternative healers. All sorts of people are bouncing patients around with all sorts of broad-spectrum antibiotics and cough syrups, taking endless rounds of iterations, and then it takes 2 months before TB is eventually diagnosed, and more time before they finally get into the DOTS program and start their therapy. During this time, do the math and ask yourself how many more people have been infected in these communities that people are living in. So there is a mismatch between where we built TB services and where people are choosing to go. And we have to figure out where do we take TB services to wherever people are going. Right? We can't try and change the behavior and say only go to the public system, but if people don't have confidence in the public system, they will go wherever they go. People are not stupid. They're making thoughtful decisions on where to go. And we need to heed that and understand and take TB services to where they are rather than where we wish they went. The next issue is the untested and the undiagnosed. This is a very vexing thing, and it's a complicated problem made up of multiple things. People seek care even in the DOTS clinic, and this is what happens to them. This is India's cascade of care or continuum care in the public free DOTS program. Even in the free DOTS program, nearly 40% of patients don't even get diagnosed. The biggest jump off in the cascade of care is diagnosis. Even among people who sought care, only 40% get diagnosed, and only about in MDR-TB, only about 10% go all the way from diagnosis to treatment in the Indian public program. In short, even when they seek care, they're just dropping through the cracks or falling through the cracks. Same thing in South Africa. Take a look. South African cascade of care with drug-sensitive TB, 1 and 2 make the finish line, all the way from diagnosis to treatment completion. MDR-TB, only about 20% make the finish line. So this is in the free public DOTS program that are already supposed to be taking care of patients. Look at pediatric TB, same thing. 1 in 5 children make the finish line. Latent tuberculosis, 1 in 5 people make the finish line. We have the leakiest cascade of care, I think, among all diseases. This is despite all the investments we've made in strengthening the DOTS program. We just cannot get our patients to the finish line and make sure they get better and stay better. Then, if you want even more evidence on how poor quality of TB care is, I cannot give you better data than this. So this is a series of published studies where we and others have sent patient actors to pretend to have TB. We send them to all sorts of clinics in all parts of the world, and we see what on earth is done to them if they show up with a textbook, walking, talking description of TB. And here is, I'm not going to give you a lot of detail because all of them are published, but this is one of our first cases that we sent. This is like a textbook description, okay? The patient will walk into the clinic and in the local language, with all the right training, will say, I have a long-term cough that is not going away. And if the healthcare provider were to ask only a few questions, then it will become very clear that this person desperately needed a TB test. If they asked how long, 2 to 3 weeks. Cough, yes. Fever, yes. Weight loss, yes. Loss of appetite, yes. Short of screaming, please test me for TB. This person had every clue you could possibly give. And guess what happens to them in 4 countries? Take a look at the results. If you went to clinics in private clinics in Delhi, you had a 1 in 5 chance of being correctly managed with all of the clues that were in the case. If you went to Mumbai, it's 37% odds of being correctly managed. Patna city, 33%. If you went to Nairobi in the private sector, it's 30%, jumps to 80% in the public sector. If you went to village clinics in China, you were 29% or 20% odds of being correctly managed. And if you went to South Africa, only 43% in the public clinics got correctly managed. In short, if you can't pick up a case that my 10-year-old girl could tell you should be tested for TB, what is the hope that this person is going to get correctly managed with all the more complicated cases that might come? What if somebody walked in with classic MDR symptoms? How are these providers going to manage? And these are all primary care providers, which means primary care providers generally, and by the way, you know what they did when they didn't diagnose TB, but everybody hit you with antibiotics. Antibiotics are the diagnostic test for tuberculosis in the primary care. First, we talk about test and treat. Here it's treat first and maybe test later. Right? That's the norm in primary care. They don't even have tests to use, by the way. We don't have a rapid dipstick for TB anyway, so they don't know what to do. So they do what they normally do. They hit you with a bunch of antibiotics, they send you home, and hope like hell that you're going to get better. It's only after you fail multiple antibiotic therapy, somebody's light bulb goes off and say, this could be TB 2 months down the line. Let me now get a chest x-ray, and eventually TB gets diagnosed. Now, we are still relying on these old tools. Robert Koch could walk into a TB clinic today and comfortably practice medicine because it's exactly the tools that he came up with. Okay? Microscope, tuberculin, all of them date back to Robert Koch. He would do beautifully in our TB clinics today. Okay? That's the state of affairs of our tool sets. Yes, there are tools like GeneXpert, but this is not an easy slide for you to see. But we've been looking at market penetration of GeneXpert, our best technology we have today. And apart from countries like South Africa, which have done very well, most countries still perform something like 100 smears for every GeneXpert that they do. Okay? So yes, we have new tools, but the access that people have are pretty dismal as far as new tools are concerned. And the last category is the unreported. Now, for this one, you have to understand that this is predominantly a problem of the private sector. Private sector often manages TB but informs nobody. That's because either they're not required to do so, or they don't care, or you could go and beg them, they don't want anything to do with the government TB program. They are disengaged from the public sector TB program. And this is a spectacular graphic, folks. Wherever there is private sector dominating, that is where your missing millions are. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Philippines, Nigeria. You add up these countries, you pretty much got majority of your missing millions. And what makes all these countries unique? They are dominated by private sector providers. You walk into an average private clinic in India, for sure they're managing TB, and you ask them, oh, have you informed the government? He said, what the hell are you talking about? I'm not expected to. And there's a law in India which demands that they notify. Nobody gives a damn for that rule. They do whatever they normally do. Okay, unless you hold a gun to their head or you give them an incentive, they don't want anything to notify. And if you do work hard, as India has done, dramatically your notifications go up. So one of the fun things that's going to happen now, if we find the missing millions, our TB epidemic first has to get worse before it actually starts getting better. Because suddenly all the unreported, unnotified cases will be brought to attention, which is what happened with the TB report. We jumped to 10.4 million because we suddenly found the missing private patients in India, and like, oh my God, TB is getting worse. It isn't getting worse. It's how it always was. We are merely uncovering what was already there before. So for a while, if we do our job well, the TB epidemic must get bad, worse, before it really starts getting better, because we're going to find massive numbers of people who are actually on treatment but never notified to the government programs. And in terms of solutions, I have these 5 things to offer you, which I think naturally flow from what I've just shown you. Firstly, we have for a long time, for all sorts of reasons, we don't have to debate it today, we built TB as a vertical program in many countries because we felt TB deserved to have that unique attention and funding and whatnot. Fine, we did it. But today, we got to find a way to bring back TB into primary care. And therefore, bringing TB into UHC is the smartest strategy we can come up with today. Just as HIV is now being managed by nurses in primary care clinics, we can try and figure out how to make TB fit into the horizontal health system, because most TB patients are going to the primary care system, and we are missing them. The second point is there are groups like men, minors, prisoners, really, really vulnerable and marginalized people who don't have any access to health or don't know how to connect themselves to the health system. We may have to actively reach them and not passively sit in our clinics and wait for them to show up. It's like sitting in a primary care clinic and expecting all men with TB to come there. They're not going to come there. You got to go find wherever they are. Thirdly, I just showed you fantastic set of data from all parts of the world. Quality of TB care sucks. And every other field has adopted quality improvement. Maternal and child health, immunization, family planning, HIV, QI is baked into their programs. Try and figure out how many national TB programs are actually doing QI. South Africa is the only one that I'm aware of right now. That too on a pilot scale in 2018. I went to a QI conference. It was the most depressing meeting for me. There were like 2,000 posters, of which 2 were on TB. I'm like, what the heck? The whole science of improvement has bypassed TB. And the only quality assurance we know is smear microscopy quality assurance. That's not what I'm talking about. Entire system needs QI. We need to bring that into TB. We must increase access to new tools. There's no point in sitting on GeneXpert, and every GeneXpert system is underutilized. What are we doing with them, right? All those investments we've made, we must make it count. And lastly, we cannot end TB, at least in those 6 massive countries that I showed you, without engaging the private health sector. It is not an ideological issue. I don't want to get into this public against private debates. All I'm saying is this is where people are going. If you want to get your act together, work with the private sector, make sure they're linked to care. If you just want to take an ideological stance, then we're going to continue working as we have before and ignore half of India's epidemic or half of Pakistan's epidemic. That is just not a choice. If you want to end TB, we must work with the private sector, and they have done it in other areas of healthcare, like maternal and child health, even in India. And Joanne is absolutely right. This is not a science issue. We can definitely science the shit out of TB. Okay? There is just no way we can't do it, but it's the money and the political commitment that is dramatically missing. I think Ebola in DRC is a beautiful example how we have scienced the shit out of Ebola, right? We deployed a vaccine, we got a GeneXpert, we got money, and boom, the epidemic is on its way out. That is an example of what is possible, and if we can do it with Ebola, why can we not do it with TB? This cartoon is by my graduate student, where I am pleading for more investments in TB, and Prime Minister Modi is telling me that he cannot spend more than 1.4% of the GDP on healthcare, right? Because she's sick of me lamenting about this, so she did a cartoon. Just to say that India, for all its rhetoric about ending TB in 2025, if India doesn't spend money on health in the first place, there is just no way on earth India is going to eliminate TB. Money has to follow the rhetoric and the ambition. And the last comment I want to make is TB desperately needs you. And that is one of the reasons why I'm here to beg and plead that all of you continue to advocate for TB, because science and scientists like me can only do so much. I think the power of advocacy is phenomenal in TB, and this is me and my students doing our bit for advocacy. I am absolutely convinced that I need to advocate, but I don't think I'm adequate. All of you need to join in, and many, many more people. I think today morning's talk was a beautiful example. The community needs to advocate for TB, not just us advocates, and they are mostly missing in TB. Community voices are hardly shown up in TB meetings. So thank you very, very much for what you do, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Tell me he's not a natural advocate. Now I'm going to invite Carol, who is really. Do you want to take the podium, or do you want? Yeah, Carol to come up here. And Carol is genuinely one of our global advocacy leaders on tuberculosis and HIV. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you. That's my tribe behind me there. And thank you very much for that presentation. It was a very good presentation, especially for somebody who has been part of those three, I think, the middle program that you talked about. I did seek care, but I was bounced here and there for a long time. So I'm standing here as a person living with HIV and a TB survivor. And as a person who's been to both programs, I have experienced both the good and the bad systems of regards with access to treatment, care, and support for both the diseases. So we are talking about the TB high-level meeting. So I wanted to say one of the critical goals of the TB high-level meeting is to reach all people by closing the gaps of TB diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. Closing these gaps, as we know, will require new resources and especially community-led, patient-centered advocacy. So before addressing the advocacy and leadership that's needed, especially at a country level, because I really want to start talking about what we should be doing at country level, talk a little bit around domestic resource mobilization, I want to speak as someone who was once what we are calling the missing millions after suffering from TB that was initially undiagnosed. So like I indicated before, after learning that I was HIV positive, I went, like he rightly said, to several clinics. I found out I think I had TB before I knew I was HIV positive. So I had what we call extrapulmonary TB, that's the TB outside the lungs, and they could not find TB. So I was bounced from clinic to clinic, and they couldn't find TB. And unfortunately, the time I got tested, I was in what we call, I think, stage 4 of HIV. I had the syndrome issue where I had a lot of other diseases, the main one being cancer, called Kaposi sarcoma. It's a type of cancer, and then TB at the same time. So as one of the 10 million people who get sick of TB every year, and about 1 million of people living with HIV have TB, and TB is still the leading cause of people living with HIV. So it took me, like I said, over 6 months of going back and forth to the hospital. I'm sure several of you here have heard my story before, especially those who've come to Zambia to visit us. So I went to the hospital several times to get a correct diagnosis. I had a dry cough, so I didn't have sputum. It was difficult for me to be diagnosed. And like we heard from the presentation, the old tools. So in Zambia at that time, we had the microscopic test, which is still used in the global south, but it's not effective. So I couldn't be diagnosed for a long time. And as a person living with HIV, like I said, it was really, really difficult. But I was one of the lucky ones who eventually had a brother who's a doctor who managed to test me himself and take me, fortunately for me, to a private clinic. And I was able to complete my treatment, and I got cured of TB. But for me, again, being a person living with HIV and AIDS, I felt if I had not been cured, or the back and forth was like a loss of investment. I've been on HIV treatment for, I think, close to 15 years now, and TB could have killed me within those 6 months. But I was one of those people who were lucky to be treated of TB, and now I'm still on my HIV meds. So lack of resources for health and lack of good diagnostic tools, like we heard before, and the stigma that affects people living with HIV and TB are the barriers. Again, like you rightly said, some people don't go to the government clinics, they go to the private clinics because of stigma. Because the private clinic, if I go to a government clinic, I'll find all my neighbors. So if I go to a very expensive private clinic, I might not find. I might go to a private clinic which is 100 miles away from my home. So stigma is still a barrier, even for me, that I had to overcome. And these are the barriers that we must collectively overcome to accelerate the progress, the progress on global TB epidemic. So for those of us in from TB high-burden countries, we are using the high-level meeting on TB to call on our governments to take a leading role in financing TB treatment and addressing the conditions that generate the disease. So we cannot continue to do business as usual. We really have to change, because we've been working around TB, doing the same things and getting the same results. So we are lucky this year, 2018, to have an opportunity to have the high-level meeting on TB, and I think we should really use this opportunity. More than anything else, we need to continue on a path towards greater self-sufficiency, as many of us are doing already, and to do so with broader scope and greater urgency, fully embracing the idea that this is something that we can do for ourselves, not just waiting for somebody else to do it for us, but we ourselves can do that. And I know a lot of us here, the activists within Results, are supporting us with that. So what are some of the key steps to national health financing? And this is what I think we should do at country level for us from high-burden countries. We should look at budget level. National governments need to take steps to increase budget allocations to health, with specific allocations to national TB programs. And at macro level, it is important, we need to take steps to improve tax revenue collections so that there is more budget space overall. This would be in keeping with the Abuja Declaration of 2001, where African leaders pledged to allocate about 15% of the annual budget to improve health sector in our countries. And at policy and programmatic level, we must all take steps to ensure that there are resources in closing the gap on TB, community mobilization, community case finding, treatment literacy, and advocacy. The financing gap isn't just about buying medicines and diagnostics. It's about investing in the communities that have the highest burden. So I think, which is one thing which is always a gap. We always leave out the communities of the people affected, but it is important to include the communities at all the steps. So I'd just like to close my remarks by sharing one of the encouraging stories about how we've taken some of the steps recently in Zambia. This is around domestic resource mobilization. My organization, CITAM Plus, which is made up of people directly affected by TB and HIV, over the years, we have built strong relationship with our government. So we work with government, we complement government efforts, and we build strong relationship with them, just as many people here are doing with your members of Congress and your parliamentarians. So we've learned that. And I'm really grateful with the results, because initially when I started coming to Results, I used to come to just go to Congress with some of the members of Results. But we've taken the Results model, we've taken it back to our country, and we're also able to engage our parliamentarians now. So, thank you. So during the last Global Fund replenishment, we worked closely with civil society organization and the government, which led to Zambia pledging for the first time ever $5 million to the Global Fund, signaling support from a high-burden country. So we are an implementing country, but we're able to get our government to also put $5 million over 5 years into the Global Fund. This also happened to other countries, including Kenya and Togo. So this needs to happen everywhere if we are going to get to NTB by 2030. And the high-level meeting is a critical opportunity for advocates in countries like Zambia and also here in the US to engage their leaders in global movement to NTB, and in doing so, build a foundation for healthier and productive and more equitable societies. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol, for all of your really inspiring kind of tireless leadership in Zambia, but also really around the world, quite literally traveling around the world to be a spokesperson on these issues. So, and now, Dr. Toto, we'd love to welcome you to the podium. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is also my first time to be with you, and I'm so delighted to be here. Today, I went to the Chinatown to enjoy some, Chinese food, and as you know, so there was a fortune cookie, and and I opened the fortune cookie and found a very symbolic words. For me, yes, the paper says, your dear friends will not ask you for your money, but they will ask you for your information. Yeah. And I hope my modest information, based on the experience in Japan, would be even a little bit useful for your future activities. And thank you very much for your sacrificing your precious time to be with me. Let me start by confirming the basic character, which has already been said, of TB. But TB is a byproduct of improper industrializations. TB is a byproduct of improper urbanization. And TB is the greatest killers of human beings. And TB is curable. And as many of my colleagues said, TB is not only a scientific issue, TB is a political issue. The prevalence of TB symbolizes the character of societies with or without equity and justice. Looking back our modern history, we have been very much successful to reduce the prevalence by 20% in 15 years. It's a result of MDGs. We need to be proud of our collective efforts, including your efforts. But still, 10 million patients and 1.5 million deaths, which does not include 4 million missing cases, or maybe even more. In addition to that, as you all know, MDR is skyrocketing. Multi-drug resistance is skyrocketing in the United States, New York, and in Tokyo as well. We talked a bit about money, but I do want to talk a bit about information and wisdom based on the Japanese experience. Since 1880 up to 1955 or 60, TB has been the greatest killer of Japanese lives. But in the midst of poverty, after 1950, we have been fairly successful to reduce the prevalence, morbidity, which is almost under control. In 1980, our life expectancy was under 40. And in 1950, after the World War II, still stayed at the level of under 50. But now, as you know, we are enjoying the longest lives for ladies around 90, and for men, nearly 90s. I don't know what shall we do after the retirement. Especially the drastic reduction of TB morbidity starts in 1960 or 65. Until 1980s, we had been successful to reduce annually 10% of morbidities. Let me anatomize the reasons very quickly. First of all, government leadership. Yes. Fortunately, when we start rapid economic growth in 1960s, 5 years before that, we have established a very strong liberal democratic party, ruling party. In addition to have some sort of bipartisan political system, we have one-party monopolies for the 3 decades, which enabled us to have a sustainable and, unchangeable and very strong TV policies. And at the same time, our local government and the community, especially community workers, most of which are ladies, they worked very, very hard. It's an irony of Japanese history. Japanese gender gap is still in a miserable stage, but for that reason, Japanese ladies who were unable to work for the society found a place for eradication of TBs and for universal health coverage. It's a kind of irony of Japanese history, but we should be taken note. At the same time, we had a very serious, famous litigation of TB and human rights issues, which started in the 1950s. Through the media, many people had been sensitized with the importance of TB and the poverty nexus, which also pushed the back of government to go for strong legislation. As you see, there are so many irony of history which might have been and which had been made full use of. And Japan is one of the cases. But still, Japan is the worst TB-contaminated country among G7. Our morbidity rate is more than double of French and British colleagues and triple compared to the United States. United States, during the last few years, you have been very remarkably successful because of your work, because of the sensitization of the people and the government. The reason, we have several reasons. One of the most serious ones is aging society. Yeah. Japan is most advanced aging society, and the majority of TB patients, new patients, are old guys like me. I'm old. Maybe I look young, but I'm old. I'm older than most of you, okay? And second reason is young poor, urban young poor, which starts to increase. They don't know what TB, and they are atomized, and they are very much underpaid. Those kinds of guys are very much increasing. And lastly, foreigners. I mean, in Japan, there are more and more foreign laborers, not only laborers, but also intellectual people that are coming into Japan. And some of them are from TB-heavy contaminated countries. So these three are the reason why Japan is still struggling in the name of middle burden country. But I have to share with you at the same time, not only about the Japanese history, but also our own efforts with developing countries. In fact, I'm sure many of you do not know that Japan started the international cooperation at the time when we are fighting domestically against TBs. I mean, we started our technical and financial cooperation with developing countries in the 1950s. And at that time, we are poor. So our financial contribution was very much negligible. what we did at that time and what we are even now doing is to show the reality, what's happening in Japan, and also to promote mutual learning among participants of the events. And I do want to make an emphasis on SDG Goal 17. You know Goal 17, talking about partnership, triangular cooperation, South-South cooperation, based on knowledge and wisdom. So we have been trying very, very hard to share the pragmatic, hands-on knowledge among TV practitioners, government, private sectors, and scholars. And those are the things which I'm very much proud of. And we did it in a very successful way to establish the network of the fight against TB globally. If we compare our country with some other countries in a dynamic way, then we'll find the solutions. Some are rich, some are not. But the scarcity of money is not, should not, must not the reason for TB prevalence. So this year, as John said, will be a very important year. And in New York, we'll have a high-level resolution. And the next year, we also have another important event on UHC. We have been fighting each other, some sort of vertical group and horizontal group since a long time ago. But now is a time to work together. And for example, Japanese history says vertical activities sometimes could be a very good method or approach to the horizontal social capital's improvement. Through the activities of TV, we have been able to establish universal health coverage at the same time with very, very limited financial resources and with affluence of passions, informations, wisdom exchange, and willingness of people. So finally, I would like to share with you my frank feeling on the advocacy. I decided to come here because of my change of mind vis-a-vis advocacy. As I told some of you in Tokyo, as a practitioner of development cooperation for more than 30 years, in most of my time, I have been very much critical to so-called advocacy type activities, to be honest. Yes, I disliked that. I disliked it because of Japanese character. Yes, in the Japanese commercial film, so some movie star drink beer, and he said, "I drink beer without speaking anything." That is a famous Japanese commercial film. Maybe some of you know. That means, so let's do it without speaking. That was traditional culture of Japan, and I followed that. But recently, quite recently, I changed drastically my mind. Yes, we need to talk. We need to make our value visible. And we need to persuade people by visualizing the merit and the risk. And ICT technologies, yes, has made us Superman, or being possible to share those information globally and simultaneously. And without showing your value, without talking, society cannot be changed. I believe there is a formula of social change. we need to have a multi-layer approach. Only government, not enough. Only to the people, no, not enough. Or should be multi-layered. And multi-diagonal approaches simultaneously and continuously. You may ask me, we have very much limited resources. But think about the character of wisdom vis-à-vis money or things. What are the difference? Information, wisdom, can be shareable with almost free cost. But if I give you $1 million, I will lose $1 million. It's an exclusive character. So let us make full use of the character of information and wisdom. And wisdom, when shared, we can have a reaction to make our common wisdom much, much more valuable and realistic and useful and effective to the human being's dream. That is my recent brief and result. And my colleagues opened my eyes for that. I really thank you. Thank you very much.